welcome! I'm wearing glasses. Congratulations. This is the only time you'll ever see me wearing glasses. My book talk is on Stumbling on Happiness by Daniel Gilbert. Let me start off with saying what I noticed first about the author, because he kind of wrote in a sarcastic tone and he made like really witty comments, which is my kind of humor. You might know that. I don't know. But honestly, the whole time I was reading, I kept thinking if I were an author, this is how I would write. And he kind of reminded me of one of my favorite YouTubers, Cody Ko. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is, although it was a loaded informational text, it was still very interesting because I found it kind of funny. Also, an example of his dry wit is right off the beginning, when he said he wasn't going to conform to the question, which is the question when all psychologists write like a research book, they have to say, the human being is the only animal that ... And then he proceeded right afterwards to say, he'd like to write it now, with you as my witness, the human being is the only animal that thinks about the future, which is the concept of the book. It's the essential, all-encompassing idea of the book. Humans are the only animal that can predict the future, good and bad outcomes, and all the steps that can lead us to that most favorable outcome. So there are three main ideas of the text. The first one would be the experience stretching hypothesis, which he defines as your experiential background can dramatically change your happiness levels. Once you know something exists and have experienced pleasure from it, then your definition of happiness changes compared to what it was in the past. And the second main idea would be that we all have psychological immune systems, which defend us in the presence of triggering experiences by filtering through our brains to generate a positive view on that experience and thus of ourselves. And kind of like your physical immune system, where it defends you against sicknesses, illnesses, germs, your psychological immune system defends you against those triggering experiences. And the third main idea would be that we as humans are constantly predicting our futures, both local and distant, which I will explain in the very, very end, using past experiences and reasoning. And the goal of this is to predict which distant future will be the most emotionally happy. So, main idea number one, the experience stretching hypothesis. The experience stretching hypothesis, again, states that your experiential background can dramatically change your happiness levels. And once you know that something exists and have experienced pleasure from it, then your definition of happiness changes compared to what it was in the past. Daniel Gilbert, what a great name. He mentioned a study that was conducted that investigated change blindness, which the same one that you actually were subjected to, that you told us about. But change blindness was defined as a perceptual phenomenon that occurs when a change in a visual stimulus is introduced and the observer doesn't notice it. He went on to explain the researcher-tourist study where a construction worker obscured the researcher with a door, and then a different researcher came in, and then the tourist, majority of the time, did not notice that the researcher had changed. So what he concluded was that we don't notice changes if we are not focused on an experience as it changes. And then that brought up the question of whether we should believe that people cannot tell when their own experiences of the world have changed right before their eyes. And he drew two very important statements from this discussion of research, that these experiences tell us that the experiences of our former selves are almost as opaque to us as the experiences of other people, meaning that we cannot physically see or look into the minds of people and understand what their past experiences were. And in a similar way, sometimes we can't even do that with ourselves, which was kind of crazy. And the second one was that unless our minds are keenly focused on a particular aspect of that experience at the very moment it changes, we will be forced to rely on our memories and forced to compare our current experience to our recollection of our former experience in order to detect that change. That's a very susceptible way of relying on our memory. And his point basically in bringing this up was that we rely on our memory to give us information about new experiences that we face in the world, which relates back to the schema theory of how they influence our intake of new information. And also in my extended essay, I discussed how the amygdala to hippocampus interactions encode what are known as emotional memories, which we talked about last year in psych. And one of the researchers I came across, she was also a neuroscientist, was Elizabeth A. Phelps, and she talked about the consolidation process, which she said is the process of transmitting something you've experienced into long-term memory in the hippocampus or by the hippocampus. And this process or transmission is slowed down by the release of stress hormones when that experience happens. And that allows for disruption from the amygdala as it's given this time to encode the emotion experienced with that memory. So then if something triggering that reminds you of that or something that triggers that memory in the future brings it back up, you're also going to have an influx of the emotions that you encoded with it, which is super cool. If we so heavily rely on our memory to perceive the world and what in it brings us happiness, but as proven in this study, for example, our memory can be quite faulty, then maybe our perception of happiness isn't as rigid as we believe it to be. He then also brought in the example of disabled people or people who have experienced other major traumas in their lives, and how when they're asked, they say, if I could do it all over again, I wouldn't have it any other way. And how we don't believe them when they say that. Like, they couldn't possibly feel that way. They're missing out on so much. As Gilbert says, we fail to imagine all other things a life might be about if imagining one that isn't our own. Hence, mispredicting how satisfying such a life can be, which is a much more professional way of saying what I just said. And then Amina and I had a discussion on why we do this that one day when you let us go in the hall. And I explained to her the example in the book of the trigram, when in the study people were presented with sets of 3-letter combinations like HYZ or BCK and STX, and they were told which one was special. So they might point to the STX one and then continue doing that with other ones, like other 3-letter combinations, and they were asked to identify what made that one special. And every answer that people gave identified the special group as having the letter T present. Yet nobody pointed out the other perspective, that all other combinations lacked a letter T. And this next quote absolutely racked my mind when I read it, and it was that it was easy to notice the presence of a letter, but like the barking of a dog, it was impossible to notice its absence. And I actually wrote mind blown in my notes because I had never thought about that. Like, when is the last time you've sat in your house and thought, you know what is so nice? Do you hear how there aren't any dogs barking right now? No, you only notice when they do bark because it's annoying. But then back to the original thing I mentioned about not being able to see such disabled lives as equally satisfying or happy. Amina said, like, the most genius thing ever that tied all this together. If you don't know what you're missing out on, then you can't miss it. But we only see it as what they're missing out on or can't do, and not maybe what other qualities they have because of what we see as their disabilities or things that they can do that might bring them the same level of happiness. Going back to how we can't look into other people's minds and see what makes them happy. And that kind of reminded me of, I went on a campus tour and at Michigan State in the ARCA program, and we did a mock class discussion where we were defining disability, and all I thought about was TOK, which was kind of frustrating because TOK is just invading my life. But the way that we see disability, the person we define as disabled might not see it the same way. So everything has just been tying together with this book, which also made it a lot more interesting to me because I was able to have all these connections. But overall, this portion of the book was a really great and exceptionally long way of stating that happiness is subjective to the individual. So everybody's predictions of their most favorable emotional future will include different takes on the things that will make them happy. And from this, people then develop logical steps that may lead them to this ultimate goal of happiness that they perceive in their mind. And this actually kind of helps explain major preferences and college choices. I'm in the college mood, if you couldn't tell. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting. Let's move on to number 2, the psychological immune system. As a refresher, This defends us in the presence of triggering emotions by filtering through our brains to generate a positive view on the experience and ourselves. And Gilbert states that when experiences make us feel sufficiently unhappy, the psychological immune system cooks facts and shifts blame in order to offer us a more positive view. And that actually kind of reminds me of when we read about the Brett Kavanaugh case in TOK, and how they were talking about how sexual assault, like the abusers, they might not see it as a significant event because in their mind, they're like, this didn't seem wrong. So they kind of shifted the blame off of themselves and saw it as normal and just because they didn't take on any of that blame because their psychological immune systems perhaps told them that it wasn't their fault in order to make themselves have a more positive view on themselves. And this is kind of why a lot of arguments happen, because nobody likes to take responsibility. Nobody likes to be at fault. We all like to make ourselves feel better. And that's why I think it's so hard for people to mature and realize that sometimes it is your fault and you can't always come defending yourself and making yourself the good guy and everybody else the bad guy. Often it's both parties that play a part in the issue. Anyway, in short summary of everything that that the psychological immune system means is that we select favorable facts from our memory to create positive views of ourselves and our experiences. And we create our own little bubble of confirmation bias by choosing people that will like us and are like us as friends. So when we turn to them for advice and opinions, the conclusions they give us that we favor will be produced. In other words, they are pre-selected for their willingness to say what we want to hear. And we also scrutinize facts that challenge our favored conclusions more closely. And he kind of gave the example of how somebody believes that someone is really smart, either because they know them personally or because they had a high GPA all throughout their high school career. One letter of recommendation will suffice to justify that. But if that person doesn't want to believe that a student who may have had a history of suspensions and a poor GPA until the senior year, they don't want to believe them to be smart, then they may require them to have a manila full of transcripts, tests, and testimony. Overall, we have a hard time accepting when our favored biases may be proven wrong, so our psychological immune system comes to the rescue and works out its own way of generating a positive view of that feeling of rejection. In the face of one-on-one rejection, we're able to recover rather quickly. Like, have you ever had the debate over a color? Is this more red or is this more orange? And then it turns out that on the tag it actually says that it's red when you said it was orange, and that person insults you, says they're right, be like, I told you so. I told you so is the worst thing to hear, okay? But you're kind of irritated, but then you get over it rather quickly because it's just a one-on-one experience. And you can justify it as, in that person's mind, they have their own perception of what that thing is. But being rejected by a large and diverse group of people, he says, is a demoralizing experience because it is so thoroughly unambiguous. Hence, it's difficult for the psychological immune system to find a way to think about this as both positive and credible. So your psychological immune system cannot turn to other ways of thinking because there's so many different ways of thinking present that there's nothing else to turn to. So you just kind of have to accept that rejection all is one. If an emotion that we are then experiencing is decidedly unpleasant, our psychological immune system will prevent any further behavior that will continue to generate those feelings in the future. And it's a defense trigger when grave threat is posed to our psychological well-being, either resulting from others or maybe ourselves. He then went on to explain how it's only when we cannot change the experience that we look for ways to change our view of the experience. We find silver linings only when we must, and we can't make the best of a fate until it is inescapably, inevitably, and irrevocably ours. Going back to the rejection example. The group rejection. And I kind of slipped into TOK mode again, which has been happening so much, and I literally wrote personal connection with Dr. Shakir. So I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but I actually went and saw a therapist like twice, and he said, you're fine, you're managing your anxiety's fine. But in this past August, I talked to my mom, decided to go back, and in mid-September, we went to Dr. Shakir, who was the only psychiatrist, she also does therapy, who properly diagnosed my brother after trying multiple. I went in with confidence with her then because she actually diagnosed him correctly. And immediately we got to discussing, and what we've been discussing these past few times is how I need to lower my expectations. And that may be for other people, worldviews, and because I kind of have been talking about relationships and how I expect people close to me to give reciprocated feelings of understanding. And I've been letting small actions build up into larger issues, and then they affect me personally, even though I understand them. Because for some reason, I'm like the friend therapist to everybody. Everybody comes to me and opens up. I understand why they do what they do because that's the kind of person they are, but I still let it affect me. And that's why she was saying that you need to lower your expectations. So when I read this line about only when we cannot change the experience itself by our psychological immune system turning to other ways of thinking, I thought back to Dr. Shakir. I can't change the people or who they are, but I can change my view on them and accept how they are and still be just as good of friends with them. All right. Number 3. We as humans are constantly predicting our futures, local and distant, using past experiences and reasoning, with the goal being to predict which distant future will be the most emotionally happy for us. All of the points made beforehand influence how these predictions are done. Subjectivity of happiness to an individual due to personal experiences that influence their perception of what happiness even is, and our psychological immune system, I'm sick of saying that word, it provides a cushion of positivity in the face of triggering experiences. And our local futures, which he actually mentioned early on, but it's basically our near futures, kind of how if you place like near goals and far goals. Near far goal? Okay, short-term goals and long-term goals. That's the word that I was thinking of. It's kind of like that. Our near futures are more susceptible to us making quick decisions as the steps to get there as a result of our predictions. But with distant futures, they're a little bit harder to predict because, like the slowed down process of encoding emotional memories, they can be susceptible to disruptions because there's so much time between now and that future. And by this, as I'm generating my own conclusion from the information I have learned from this book, I mean that disruptions, in this case, to be new challenges to our psychological immune systems and new experiences that influence our perception of happiness, which will alter how we predict a distant emotional future, kind of like how the emotions will alter our encoding of that memory. Cool. Okay, conclusions. When I was reading it, a lot of his claims were made with follow-up examples. Like, he would go through this kind of difficult concept and then immediately give an example after, which actually helped me understand it a lot better. And I mentioned a few of them throughout this talk. But I also thought that a lot of the times there wasn't actual, like, factual evidence, which I guess you can't have serious factual evidence in psychology because there's always... Amina and I were talking about that too, how it's kind of frustrating how in psychology you can't have a conclusive answer because there's all these different confounding variables and things that people can think of that and be like, well, what if this affected it instead? Which is so frustrating. But there wasn't like evidence, I guess, that supplied support to his claims sometimes. Like, he would apply his claims to common real life examples, but if you were to look at it through a different person's perspective, they could do the same thing using what they know. So some of what he said, I just kind of had to take as is and accept the statements. But a lot of it I thought was really well done, honestly. I did have there were a few questions, but then later on as I read, they would kind of be answered. But one that I actually was thinking about a lot was, because I talked about it too, was that example of group rejection. Can it be more harmful sometimes than beneficial for our psychological immune systems to always search for a positive outlook on our experience? Because I was like, with that group rejection example, I felt like not necessarily being able to find that positive view could kind of be a reality check of sorts, that people aren't always going to be considerate in this world, and you're going to have to accept that rather than justify it as a good experience in your mind. But Then I thought this could be explained by the knowledge I gained at the end, where I concluded that our perceptions of happiness and predictions of the future can change. Facing that rejection, having a reality check, might be one of those ways that our perceptions can be altered. Overall, I found myself able to interpret my kind of own meaningful conclusion using the knowledge that I gained. But I really enjoyed this book because it incorporated some sarcasm and dry wit, which is right up my alley, and it also made me think a lot deeper. So it was like two very contrasting things coming together. And you know that it's a good read if you start having conversations with your friends about it. But you know that it's going to be good if you actually feel like you want to share that information. I think that we as a society, or maybe even just me individually, can take this information and understand how happiness differs amongst everybody. And we may break down our preconceived notions about the ideal standard of happiness and start accepting that, for example, disabled people can have the same happiness experience that we can have. And maybe then people wouldn't feel so awkward when approaching them. Because I've seen people that definitely don't know how to act around somebody who, say, is paralyzed. There was a girl that I knew, and I think she goes to the park now too, but like, people were always uncomfortable being around her because they felt a sort of pity in the way that she had to live her life. And I was like, but now I'm thinking, what if she, and I kind of always did think this, but this especially is now helping me think, we're all experiencing our same levels of happiness, like the same level of happiness, just in different ways. And I was like, so maybe if we can all accept the fact of this differing happiness, then maybe we will one day all enjoy one common sense of happiness together. Yeah, it was a good book, and I don't know if you've read it, but if you didn't, then you should read it. Okay, bye. Hope this made sense. Okay, I should do like a marker. And what I know, which is the question that all psychologists, when they're writing a research book paper, we're not doing this again. So, I'm having a hard time. I'm so sorry. Ask Amina, she's a germaphobe, which is kind of what is the word? Flimsy? And as Gilbert, and as he says, where in a study people were presented with sets of three-letter let's say somebody in the admission, or somebody, like let's say, or if you tell somebody something you believe they know, have you? That's how I need to lower my expect by defending. Oh my God, my brother's talking. And subjectivity of happiness provides a cushion of obscured the person with the door. I am sick of saying the word perception. I mean, that's what I figured out. Every book that I've read so far, I've either talked to my mom about. A lot of it I talked to Amina about. Oh.